He felt like a fraud. That was the honest truth, a thought that gnawed at him whenever he was alone in his studio, surrounded by prints that critics called masterful and technically brilliant. His name was Elias, and he was a photographer who had built a career on capturing the skeletons of old buildings. But lately the skeletons felt hollow. He'd stare at his own work, at the perfect contrast and sharp lines of an abandoned factory or a derelict farmhouse, and feel nothing. It was clean. It was empty. It was architecture without a soul. He was tired of taking pictures. He wanted to tell a story, a real one, etched in rust and decay and defiance. This feeling, this creative drought, had driven him out of the city and up the winding coastal roads, with no destination in mind other than a need to escape the echo of his own sterile success, and then he saw it. It wasn't a grand reveal, just a glimpse through a break in the fog as he rounded a sharp bend. A single, slender tower, white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, standing on a cliff that looked like the edge of the world. The Meridian Point Lighthouse. Even from a distance, it spoke to him. It wasn't just a building. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a long, forgotten sentence. It leaned, almost imperceptibly, like an old man tired of standing but too proud to sit down. The sea around it was a churning, angry gray, smashing against the dark rocks below. He pulled his car over, killed the engine, and just watched. For the first time in months, the itch in his hands wasn't one of frustration, but of creation. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was the subject he had been searching for. The next few days became a ritual. He'd wake before dawn, pack his gear, and find a new vantage point, always at a safe, respectful distance. He set up his tripod on grassy hillsides and rocky outcrops, framing the lighthouse against the moody sky. But the pictures he took were disappointing. They were pretty, certainly. The lighthouse made for a striking silhouette against a sunrise, a lonely figure in the twilight mist. But they were postcards. They didn't capture the feeling he had when he looked at it, that sense of a desperate, beautiful struggle against the elements. He was an observer, and his work felt like it. He needed to be closer. He needed to be inside its world, not just looking at it. This desire led him into the small, salt-worn town that huddled in the bay below the lighthouse. It was a place of fishing boats and seafood shacks, where the air smelled of diesel and fried clams. He was sitting in a small diner, stirring a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the distant tower, when an old man slid into the booth opposite him. The man had a face like a worn nautical chart, all lines and creases, with eyes that were the pale, washed-out blue of the winter sea. He didn't introduce himself, he just followed Elias's gaze out the window. "She's a beauty, ain't she?" The old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Even in her sickness?" Elias nodded. "I've been trying to photograph her." The old man let out a short, humorless laugh. "From a distance, I hope. That's the only way to love her anymore." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The name tag on his worn jacket read Silas. "I'm the harbor master, son. Been watching over this bay for 60 years. I've seen that lighthouse stand proud through storms that would rip the steel off a ship. But her time is done." He pointed a finger, his knuckles swollen and gnarled. "The cliff underneath her is weeping. The whole damn thing is rotting from the inside out. One good shake, one big nor'easter, and she go, and anything on her with it." Silas's words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. "The city put up that fence for a reason," he continued, his tone softening slightly. "It's not just about paperwork. It's about not having to pull a body out of the surf. You look like a smart young man. You've got a good eye. Stay away from that rock. Some stories aren't worth the price of admission." Elias thanked him, his voice quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't explain that for an artist. A warning like that wasn't a stop sign. It was a starting pistol. The danger Silas described, the weeping, cliff, and the sickness of the structure that wasn't a reason to stay away. It was the whole point. It was the soul he had been searching for, the story that needed to be told. The risk was the final, essential ingredient that would transform a simple photograph into a testament. As he left the diner, the warning seemed to follow him. The young woman at the front desk of his small guest house mentioned it casually when he asked about the hiking trails. "Oh, you don't want to go up near the old light," she said, her cheerfulness dimming for a moment. "It's super unstable. My cousin's friend fell up there a few years back, broke his leg in 2 places. They had to airlift him out. Even the gas station attendant, when he saw Alelius's camera gear in the back seat, felt the need to offer his 2 cents. Be careful if you're going up that way, mister. That whole area is a trap waiting to snap shut." Each person, with their own piece of caution, was just adding fuel to the fire inside him. They saw a hazard, a liability, a tragedy waiting to happen. He saw a masterpiece waiting to be born. The lighthouse wasn't just a decaying building anymore. It was a challenge. It was a forbidden fruit hanging on the edge of a crumbling cliff. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood by the window of his room, the lighthouse a faint white shape under the moonlight, a ghost standing guard over the dark, restless ocean. The words of the harbor master echoed in his mind. "Stay away." But another voice, a louder, more insistent one from deep within his artist's heart, was chanting something else entirely. "Go closer." He knew then, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he had no choice. He had to go. He had to see it up close, to touch its weathered bricks, to breathe its decaying air. He was warned, yes, but he was also called, and the call was stronger. The warning from the old harbor master echoed in his mind, a constant loop of "stay away" that played in the quiet moments. But for every voice that told him to turn back, there was a louder, more compelling whisper inside him that said, "Go closer." It was a conflict that wore him down, a tug-of-war between common sense and a deep artistic hunger. He spent the next day in his room, restlessly pacing, looking out the window at the lighthouse. It was no longer just a building. It was a challenge, a dare. Every time he looked at it, he felt a pang of regret for not being closer, for not seeing what was hidden behind that crumbling facade. He knew he wouldn't be able to leave this town with a clear conscience unless he answered that dare. The decision didn't come with a lightning bolt of clarity. It settled in slowly, like a cold fog rolling in from the sea. He would go. Not tomorrow, not when he was braver, but tonight. In the dark, when the world was asleep and his own fear had nowhere to hide, he waited until 3 in the morning, a time when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of fog, which was perfect. It was a cloak for him to wear. He dressed in dark, quiet clothes, his camera bag feeling both heavier and lighter than it ever had before. Heavier with the weight of what he was about to do, lighter with the thrill of it. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs as he slipped out of the guest house and into the cool, damp night. The air smelled of salt and wet earth. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic crash of waves and the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel road. He walked towards the lighthouse, not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim approaching a sacred, forbidden site. Soon he reached it. The chain-link fence loomed out of the fog, a stark, black line in the gray world. The sign, barely visible in the dim light, was a stark reminder of the world's rules: danger, unstable structure, nitrogen monoxide trespassing. He stood there for a long moment, the words a final test of his resolve. He thought of the harbor master's weathered face, of the gas station attendant's casual warning. But then he looked past the fence, up at the dark silhouette of the tower, and felt that pull again. It was stronger than any warning. He found a spot where the fence had been bent away from a post, a small gap created by some previous trespasser or maybe by the wind itself. He squeezed through, the cold metal scraping against his back, a small price for entry. He was on the other side now. An outlaw, the path up the cliff was worse than he imagined. It was less of a path and more of a suggestion of where to walk. The ground was soft and spongy, and in places it had completely eroded away, leaving behind sheer drops into the churning darkness below. He moved slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care, his hands out for balance. The wind picked up, pushing against him, as if trying to shove him back towards the safety of the fence. He could feel the cliff vibrating slightly with every wave that smashed into its base far below. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was groaning under its own weight. Every few steps he'd stop and listen, his senses on high alert, half expecting the ground to give way beneath him. The fear was a physical presence, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was mixed with a strange, electrifying energy. He was more alive in that moment than he had been in years. Finally, he reached the base of the lighthouse. Up close, it was even more magnificent and more terrifying. The white paint was almost gone, peeled away by decades of salt and wind to reveal the dark, weathered bricks underneath. A thick, green-black moss clung to the lower sections like a strange, shaggy beard. The huge wooden door at its base was swollen and warped, hanging slightly ajar as if inviting him in. He hesitated, his hand resting on the rough, damp wood. This was the point of no return. Once he stepped inside, there was no turning back until his work was done. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. It groaned a long, mournful sound like a sigh from a sleeping giant. The air that hit him was thick and heavy. A cocktail of smells he couldn't untangle: damp stone, the sharp tang of salt, the sweet, earthy scent of mold, and the metallic bite of rust. It was the smell of time itself, of a place forgotten by the world. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, a narrow cone of white light that danced on the walls. The inside was a circular room, empty except for debris that had fallen from the ceiling over the years. Puddles of brackish water dotted the floor, and the walls were streaked with long, dark stains like tears. In the center of the room, the spiral staircase began its ascent into darkness, a wrought iron ribbon coiling up into the unknown. It looked fragile, almost delicate. He started to climb, one hand on the cold, rusted handrail, the other carrying his heavy camera bag. Each step was a gamble. The metal treads groaned under his weight, and some of them felt spongy, as if the rust had eaten all the way through. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, a lonely, metallic clang that spiraled up into the darkness above him. The entire tower seemed to sway gently, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that was deeply unsettling. He could feel the vibrations from the waves traveling up through the solace of his boots, a constant rhythmic shudder that reminded him he was standing on a dying thing. He didn't look down. He just focused on the next step, and the next, his breathing shallow and controlled. He was a climber on a mountain of rust, scaling the inside of a skeleton. He reached the top, what was once the lantern room. The glass that once protected the great light was mostly gone, shattered by storms or vandals. The wind howled through the empty frames, a wild, mournful song. He was completely exposed to the elements, standing in the belly of the beast as it roared. He carefully set down his bag, his hands shaking from a mix of cold, fear, and sheer adrenaline. This was it. The moment he had risked everything for. He pulled out his tripod, its legs scraping against the stone floor. He mounted his camera, the familiar click of the lens locking into place a comforting sound in the chaos. He looked through the viewfinder, and the world outside transformed. The swirling fog and angry waves were no longer just a threat. They were a part of the composition. He was no longer just a man in a tower. He was a conductor, and the storm was his orchestra. He began to shoot. Long exposures, capturing the movement of the clouds and the ghostly trails of the waves. He forgot about the danger, forgot about the warnings, forgot about the groaning tower beneath him. He was lost in his work, in a silent conversation with the lighthouse. He was trying to capture its voice, its story of defiance and loneliness. He moved around the small space, trying different angles, framing the decay against the wild beauty of the sea outside. Hours passed, marked only by the slow turning of the earth. And then it happened. The sun began to rise. It wasn't a dramatic, fiery sunrise, but a slow, gentle bleeding of light into the fog. Thin, golden beams of light started to pierce the gloom, cutting through the dusty air inside the lantern room like spotlights. They illuminated details he hadn't seen before, the intricate patterns of rust on the metal walls, the delicate frost on the broken glass, the texture of the worn stone floor. It was magical. The lighthouse was no longer just a dark, decaying shell. It was a cathedral, and the morning sun was lighting it up for a service he alone was attending. He worked frantically, knowing this light was a fleeting gift. Capturing image after image, his camera's shutter clicking like a happy heartbeat. When the light faded and the sun was fully up, he finally stopped. He was exhausted, cold, and sore, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a very long time. He packed up his gear slowly, his movements deliberate. The journey down was just as treacherous, but it felt different. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a deep sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had faced the warnings and the danger, and he had been rewarded. He squeezed back through the fence as the first birds of the morning began to sing, the world waking up around him, oblivious to the secret he now carried back in the safety of his room. He didn't even take off his wet jacket. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out his camera, and started scrolling through the images. As he looked at each one, his breath caught in his throat. They were more than he could have ever hoped for. They weren't just pictures of a building. They were portraits. You could feel the cold, hear the wind, see the years of struggle etched into every rusted surface. He had captured the lighthouse's soul. In one photo, a single beam of light illuminated a rusty staircase, making it look like a path to heaven. In another, the swirling fog outside the broken glass looked like a ghost trying to get in. He knew, with a certainty that brought tears to his eyes, that he had something special. He had been warned to stay away, but he had gone closer. And in doing so, he hadn't just taken a picture. He had created a masterpiece. And he also knew with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. One visit would not be enough. The images from that first illegal visit were like a drug. Back in the quiet anonymity of his city studio, he would pull them up on his large screen, getting lost in the world he had captured. The single beam of light hitting the rusty staircase, the fog swirling like a living thing outside the broken glass, each photo was a victory. But the high was fleeting. Soon, a restlessness would set in, a gnawing feeling that he had only scratched the surface. He had seen the lighthouse in its gentle, morning mood. He hadn't seen it angry. He hadn't seen it in its deepest sorrow. The portfolio felt incomplete, a story with only the first chapter written. He knew, with a sinking and thrilling certainty, that he had to go back. This time, there was no fear holding him back, only a burning impatience. The warnings from the town faded into a dull background noise, irrelevant to the mission. His life began to warp around the lighthouse, everything else becoming a blurry distraction. He ignored the calls from his agent, letting them go to voicemail. Deadlines for commercial gigs, the very work that paid his rent, passed by unnoticed. His friends texted, asking if he wanted to grab a beer, and he'd reply with short, non-committal answers, his real attention focused on the weather app on his phone. He wasn't checking for sunny days anymore. He was praying for storms. He spent his savings on a new, more rugged camera body and a lens that could see in the near dark, tools for a job that was consuming him. His second visit was a different beast entirely. He went during the day, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind was a physical force, whipping at his clothes and trying to tear the camera from his hands. The climb up the cliff was a battle against the gale, and he had to crawl the last few yards on his hands and knees. Inside, the lighthouse was no longer a quiet sanctuary. It was a howling cavern. The wind screamed through the empty lantern room, and the tower swayed more noticeably, a rhythmic, sickening lurch that made his stomach churn. He set up his tripod, his body braced against the movement, and pointed his lens out at the raging sea. The waves were monsters, huge walls of dark green water that exploded against the cliff base, sending shockwaves through the entire structure. He wasn't trying to create beauty this time. He was trying to capture fury. He wanted to photograph the lighthouse not as a victim, but as a warrior in the middle of a fight. It was during this trip that the tower fought back. He was on the spiral staircase, trying to get a shot of the swirling debris in the central void, when his foot slipped on a wet, rusted tread. For a heart-stopping second, he was airborne, then he crashed hard onto the metal steps. Pain exploded in his side, sharp and immediate. He lay there for a moment, the wind howling around him, His breath caught in his throat. He slowly sat up, his ribs screaming in protest. He knew he should stop. He knew he should get out, get himself checked out. But he looked up, saw the dark, dramatic sky framed by the circular staircase, and the artist in him overruled the man. He gritted his teeth, ignored the fire in his side, and kept shooting. When he got back to his room that night, he lifted his shirt and saw a deep, ugly bruise already spreading across his ribs, a mottled map of his foolishness. He iced it, took some painkillers, and started planning his next trip. The obsession was no longer a secret he kept from the world. It was a secret he kept from himself. He stopped looking in the mirror. He didn't want to see the man with the hollow eyes and the permanent cough, a dry, hacking thing that had taken up residence in his chest from breathing in the tower's damp, moldy air. He lived on coffee and energy bars, his body a mere vehicle for transporting his camera to the cliff's edge. A friend from the city showed up unannounced at his studio, worried by his silence. He found the place in disarray, takeout containers on the floor, and Elias, pale and thin, staring intently at a photo of a rusted doorknob. "Hey, what's going on?" "You look like hell," his friend said, his voice full of genuine concern. Elias jumped, startled. "Oh, hey, just busy." "A new project. Is it paying the bills?" "Because your agent called me, said you've gone off the grid." "It's important," Elias said, his eyes already drifting back to the screen. It's everything." His friend looked around the room, at the piles of bills, the dust gathering on the furniture, and then back at Elias. "Man, you need to take a break? Whatever this is, it's eating you alive." But he couldn't explain. How could he tell his friend that he was in love with a dying building? That he felt a kinship with its lonely struggle? That every time he was away from it, a piece of him felt missing? He just mumbled an excuse and ushered his friend out, the guilt a bitter taste in his mouth, but not enough to change his course. He was in too deep. He began visiting at all hours. A moonless night, where the only light was the faint phosphorescence of the waves, taught him the true meaning of darkness. He used long 30-minute exposures to capture the stars as they traced perfect circles in the sky above the silent tower. He rent in the harsh glare of the midday sun, which revealed every crack, every flake of paint, every flaw with brutal honesty. He was no longer just taking pictures. He was conducting an autopsy, trying to understand the lighthouse's life by examining its corpse. He felt like a priest tending to a forgotten god, and the lighthouse was his church. He would sit for hours in the dusty lantern room, not even taking pictures, just listening. Listening to the wind, to the groan of the metal, to the distant cry of the gulls. He was trying to absorb its essence, to understand its final, lonely stand against the inevitable. One evening, after a long day of shooting in a damp, drizzling rain, he finally looked at his reflection in a piece of broken glass on the floor. He saw a stranger, a gaunt, haunted figure with wild eyes and a layer of grime on his skin. The bruise on his ribs was a sickly yellow-green. He looked away, a wave of disgust and fear washing over him. What was he doing? This wasn't art. It was madness. He was destroying himself for a pile of bricks and rust. He packed his gear with a sense of finality, a promise to himself that this was it. The last time. He was done. Driving back to the city, he felt a sense of relief. The spell was broken. He could go back to his life, to paying his bills, to being a person again. He turned on the radio, trying to drown out the thoughts in his head. But then the weather report came on. The forecaster's voice was serious, urgent. A massive storm system forming off the coast, potentially the most powerful in a decade. We're urging everyone in low-lying coastal areas to evacuate. This is not a drill. Expect hurricane-force winds and record-breaking storm surge. Elias's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He felt the pull, the old, familiar addiction, yanking him back with incredible force. A storm like that, the lighthouse in the middle of that. It wouldn't just be a warrior in a fight. It would be its final, glorious, tragic battle. It would be the ultimate story, the ultimate photograph. The relief he had felt just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a feverish, terrifying excitement. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that he had to be there. He wasn't done. He was just getting ready for the final act. The voice on the radio was calm, but the words were a war cry. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as the forecaster described the storm system with an almost scientific detachment. Potentially the most powerful in a decade. The phrase echoed in the small confines of his car. For anyone else, it was an order to evacuate, a call to board up windows and flee to safety. For him, it was an invitation. It was the final, perfect chapter to the story he had been risking everything to tell. A cold dread settled in his stomach, but it was mixed with a feverish, terrifying excitement. He knew, with a certainty that overshadowed every rational thought, that he had to be there. This wasn't just a storm. It was the lighthouse's last stand, and he had to be its witness. The drive back to the coast was a journey into the heart of chaos. The world was fleeing. He passed long lines of cars packed with belongings, families with tense faces heading inland, away from the sea. He was the only one going the other way. The rain started as a drizzle, then became a downpour, until it was no longer falling but being thrown horizontally at his windshield by a wind that howled like a wounded animal. His wipers were useless, smearing the water into a translucent film. He drove by feel, by the faint glow of the taillights he was leaving behind, his world shrinking to the small, illuminated patch of road directly in front of him. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was madness, that he should turn around, but the pull of the lighthouse was a physical force, dragging him forward into the storm's maw. He left his car a mile from the cliff, the road already becoming impassable with debris and flooding. From there, he continued on foot, and the storm welcomed him with open arms. The wind was a solid wall, a physical presence that slammed into him, stealing his breath and nearly knocking him off his feet. He leaned into it at a 45-degree angle, like a man walking against a hurricane. His raincoat was useless. The water found its way down his neck, soaking him to the bone. The path up the cliff was now a waterfall of mud and loose rock. What had been a treacherous climb before was now a vertical, slippery nightmare. He didn't walk. He crawled. He dug his fingers into the mud, his boots searching for any hint of solid ground, his body aching with the effort. The sound was overwhelming, the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and a new, deeper sound, the groan of the cliff itself as the sea hammered at its foundations. When he finally reached the base of the lighthouse, it was a scene from a nightmare. The tower was no longer silent. It was screaming. The wind tore through its empty glass frames with a high-pitched shriek, and the entire structure vibrated with a low, gut-wrenching moan. Waves, impossibly large, were exploding against the cliff face just below it, sending plumes of white water hundreds of feet into the air, drenching him in cold, salty spray. He felt a moment of pure, primal fear. This was not a place for a man. This was a place for the sea and the sky to do battle. But then he saw it. In a brief flash of lightning, the lighthouse stood silhouetted against the churning black ocean, a defiant, lonely warrior. And the fear was replaced by a grim, focused purpose. He forced the door open against the wind and stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. The relative quiet was a shock, but the tower was still moving, swaying with a sickening, irregular rhythm that felt like it was about to tear itself apart. He knew he couldn't stand on the stairs. They were too unstable. He had an idea, one that was as crazy as everything else he had done. He pulled a length of climbing rope and a harness from his bag. He had brought it just in case, a small nod to self-preservation. He wrapped the rope around the thickest, most solid-looking iron support beam in the center of the lantern room and clipped himself in. He was tethering himself to a dying beast. With his body secured, he could finally work. His hands, numb with cold, fumbled with his camera. He attached it to the tripod, his movements practiced and automatic despite the chaos. He was an artist in his element, a storm chaser in his cathedral. He peered through the viewfinder, and the world transformed into a framed masterpiece of chaos. The waves were not just water. They were liquid mountains, rising and collapsing with terrifying power. The sky was not just dark. It was a boiling black cauldron, lit from within by flashes of lightning. He started to shoot, his finger pressing the shutter again and again. The camera's rapid-fire click, a tiny, defiant sound against the roar of the storm. He was lost in the moment. A state of pure concentration where the danger faded away and there was only him, the camera, and the raw, untamed beauty of the scene. He was trying to capture the lighthouse not as a victim, but as a symbol of endurance. He wanted a single frame that held all the fury, all the loneliness, and all the defiance of this moment. He waited, his heart pounding, for the perfect light. And then it came. A massive, jagged spear of lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in a brilliant blue-white flash. In that fraction of a second, the lighthouse was no longer a dark silhouette. It was a gleaming silver spear, every rivet, every rust streak, every scar visible in stunning detail, standing firm against a churning, black sea that looked like it wanted to swallow the whole world. He pressed the shutter. Click. It was the only sound that mattered. And then the world shifted. A deep, grinding crack came from below. Not the sound of metal groaning, but of stone and earth giving way. The entire tower lurched violently, a sickening sideways drop that felt like the end of the world. He was thrown against his harness, the rope digging painfully into his sides. The camera, still on its tripod, skittered across the floor. The groaning of the lighthouse turned into a high-pitched scream of tortured metal. The floor beneath his feet tilted at an impossible angle. He was no longer an artist. He was a man trapped in a collapsing building, 100 feet above a raging sea. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through his focus. Survival instinct took over. He fumbled with the clip on his harness, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely work the buckle. He finally freed himself, scrambling on the now angled floor towards his camera. It was a stupid, irrational impulse, but the obsession was that strong. He couldn't leave it behind. He snatched the camera, cradling it to his chest like a child, and began to crawl towards the staircase. The tower was listing so badly that the stairs were now at a near horizontal angle. He half slid, half fell down them, banging his elbows and knees, his only thought to get out. The sound of another massive crack from above spurred him on. He didn't look back. He burst out of the door at the base and didn't stop. He ran, or rather stumbled, and fell down the muddy cliffside, not caring about the rocks tearing at his clothes or the mud filling his boots. He just wanted to get away, to put distance between himself and the screaming, dying tower. He finally reached the bottom, collapsing onto the ground, his chest heaving, his body a symphony of pain. He was soaked, shivering, and bruised, but he was alive. He turned back, his heart still hammering against his ribs, and looked at the lighthouse one last time. As he watched, another huge wave slammed into the base of the cliff. With a slow, grinding roar that he felt more than heard, a massive section of the cliff face, including a part of the lighthouse's foundation, simply broke away and tumbled into the sea. The tower shuddered, leaning even more precariously, but it didn't fall. Not yet. He had his shot. He had his masterpiece. And he had almost paid for it with his life. The world came back to him in slow, painful waves. First was the cold, a deep, bone-chilling wetness that had seeped into his very core. Then came the pain, a symphony of aches from his bruised ribs, his scraped elbows, and his screaming muscles. He lay on the muddy ground at the base of the cliff, the rain still hammering down, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The adrenaline that had fueled his desperate escape had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. He pushed himself up onto his elbows and looked back. The lighthouse was still there, but it was wounded. It leaned at a sickening, unnatural angle, like a felled tree not yet touching the ground. The wound in the cliffside was a dark, gaping scar against the gray dawn. He had done it. He had gotten the shot, and the tower had paid the price. The journey back to his car was a daze. He stumbled through the mud, his mind replaying the grinding crack and the violent lurch of the tower. He didn't feel like a triumphant artist. He felt like a survivor of a shipwreck. Every gust of wind made him flinch. Every distant sound of the storm made his heart race. He was a man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, blinking once with a flash of lightning before trying to swallow him whole. When he finally reached his car, he collapsed into the driver's seat, not even bothering to take off his wet, muddy clothes. He just sat there, shivering, staring out the windshield at the storm-ravaged world. The camera bag was on the seat next to him, heavy with the weight of his obsession. He reached over and touched it, a silent acknowledgement of the pact he had made. The drive back to the city was a blur. The storm was beginning to weaken, but the roads were a mess of fallen branches and flooding. He drove mechanically, his thoughts a million miles away, replaying the events of the night. He felt a profound sense of guilt, as if he had personally wounded the old lighthouse. He had gone there to capture its soul, and in doing so he had hastened its end. He was a parasite, feeding on its beauty and its struggle, and he had almost been crushed when his host finally fought back. It was a long time before he could bring himself to even look at the camera. Back in the sterile quiet of his studio, the contrast was jarring. The space was clean, orderly, and safe. He was a mess of mud, salt, and fear. He peeled off his wet clothes, his body protesting with every movement, and stood under a hot shower for a long time, trying to wash away the memory of the cold and the terror. But it clung to him. He could still feel the vibration of the tower in his bones, still hear the scream of the wind in his ears. Finally, wrapped in a robe, a cup of hot coffee warming his hands, he sat down at his computer. The camera was on the desk, a silent testament to his madness. With a deep breath, he connected the cable. The thumbnails began to load on his screen, a grid of small, dark squares. He scrolled through them, his heart pounding. Most were a blurry, chaotic mess, a testament to the violent shaking of the tower and his own trembling hands. He saw shots of the churning sea, the dark sky, the interior of the lantern room tilted at a crazy angle. They were all failures. A wave of despair washed over him. Had he risked everything for nothing? Had he almost died for a folder full of useless images? He kept scrolling, his hope dwindling with each passing picture. And then he saw it, he clicked on the thumbnail, and the image filled his screen. It was the one. The lightning shot. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was more than a photograph. It was alive. The lighthouse, bathed in the brilliant blue-white flash, was not a decaying ruin. It was a warrior forged of silver and stone, every rivet and rust scar sharp and clear. It stood firm, proud, and utterly defiant against a black, churning sea that looked like solid ink. The waves were frozen in mid-crash, their white foam a violent explosion against the darkness. You could feel the power of the storm, the fury of the wind, the immense, lonely courage of the structure. It wasn't just a picture of a building in a storm. It was a portrait of a spirit. It was the lighthouse's soul, captured in a single, breathtaking fraction of a second. He stared at it, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had been warned to stay away, but he had gone closer. And he had created a masterpiece. He named it The Last Watch. He didn't call his agent. He didn't post it online. This photo was different. It deserved more than a quick splash on social media. He printed a single, large copy, the best quality his printer could manage. He looked at the physical print, the weight of it in his hands, and knew what he had to do. He packaged it carefully and mailed it, not to a gallery or a magazine, but to the small diner in the coastal town, addressed simply, "To the harbor master." He didn't include a note. The image would have to speak for itself. Weeks passed. The storm became old news. He healed, both physically and mentally. The obsession had burned itself out, leaving behind a quiet, profound respect. He heard through the news that the Meridian Point Lighthouse had been deemed a total loss. The damage to the cliff was too severe. It was scheduled for demolition before it could collapse on its own. It felt like an obituary for a friend. Then one day his phone rang. It was a journalist from a major art magazine. They had gotten a tip about an extraordinary photograph that had been seen in a small coastal town diner. The story had spread. A local reporter had written about it, and now the art world was buzzing. The Last Watch was an overnight sensation. It won the most prestigious award in photography. It was acquired by a national museum where it would hang forever. People lined up to see it. They didn't just see a photo. They felt the story. They understood the defiance, the loneliness, the beauty, and the struggle. The photograph gave the old lighthouse a new life, a legendary status it never had when it was just a crumbling ruin on a cliff. One afternoon, he received a plain, handwritten letter with no return address. Inside was a short note on a piece of diner stationery. The handwriting was shaky, like a map of old roads. "I saw your picture," it read. "I understand now. You didn't just take its picture. You gave it a voice. Thank you." There was no name, but he knew who it was from. The warning had been lifted. The circle was complete. He never returned to that part of the coast. He didn't need to. The lighthouse was with him now, not as a memory of a reckless obsession, but as a reminder of the price and the power of art. He continued to take pictures, but his work had changed. It had a depth, a humanity that it had lacked before. He had gone looking for a subject with a soul and had found one by almost losing his own. He had been warned to stay away, a simple piece of advice meant to keep him safe. But by ignoring it, he had faced his fears, touched the sublime, and in the end, had granted immortality to a forgotten warrior on a cliff, ensuring its last watch would never truly end.